Good afternoon. Welcome to the GANThead.com Project Headway webinar for Thursday, the 19th of July, 2012. My name is Mark Mullaly. I will be your presenter for today. We are talking today about megaprojects and why they're different and also what makes them similar. And what we'll be spending a little bit of time on, looking at our objectives for the day, is first off, talking about what megaprojects actually are and spending some time exploring what makes megaprojects different. As well, we'll talk about how to evaluate how megaprojects are similar to smaller projects. What are those similarities that are common regardless of the size, regardless of the scale of the project? And based upon that, what lessons can megaprojects offer to the rest of us as we look at managing our projects as well? In terms of the webinar process, some things you need to know. This is a GoToWebinar presentation. It comprises two fundamental components. First off is a PowerPoint presentation, which you should be seeing on the screen in front of you, and as well a computer-based audio stream delivered over the internet and playing either through your speakers or through headsets connected to your computer. If you have any problems at all as we go through today's session, please feel free to email Heather. She can be reached at heather@ganthead.com and is standing by to provide whatever assistance might be required. If you have questions, and I hope you do, like to make this as interactive and as collaborative as possible, please do submit a question in the questions box on the right-hand side of your screen. We will be answering those during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Recognizing depending on the number we receive, we may not be able to answer all questions, but we will endeavor to work through as many of them as we can in the time that we have available. This presentation is being recorded for future reference and will be able to be downloaded from the ganthead.com site. And as well, it is a presentation that, as always, is eligible for professional development units. So if you are a PMP, a CAPM, or hold any other of PMI's certifications, we'll have information available for you at the end of the broadcast on how to claim your PDUs and how to process those on the PMI site. So let's talk about what we're going to cover today. After we've moved through our introduction, as usual, we'll spend a little bit of time defining our terms. And we're going to explore why megaprojects are a different reality from the majority of projects we typically encounter. What is it that makes them different, as well as, following that, how are they similar? How are those similar to other projects that we might typically conduct? We'll talk about the lessons of managing megaprojects and what insights that megaprojects have for us in terms of managing our own projects. And as I've already mentioned, we'll finish off the broadcast with a question and answer session at the end. So let's start with defining our terms. And as always, what we try to do is be clear about the concepts that we are exploring in our Project Headway broadcast. In this case, what is a megaproject? For the most part, when we're talking about the term megaproject, it's a term that's used commonly, but it doesn't necessarily actually mean the same thing in all instances. So it's an important thing to probe for meaning about. What we typically think of as a megaproject is an extremely large-scale investment project. Typically, that's defined as a project with costs that are more than $1 billion. So when we're actually looking at an overall budget of the project, and we're talking about the project cost, not necessarily the ongoing operating lifecycle cost, but we're talking about project investment costs of $1 billion or more, and in many cases, megaprojects are well in excess of that threshold. That typically is a scale that we look above in terms of determining whether or not something is considered to be a mega project. As well, these are projects that are highly visible, and that's in part because of the size and scale of their budgets and the size and scale of the project itself, but it's also recognizing that these projects have substantial impacts on communities, on environments, as well as on budgets, not just necessarily organizational budgets, but also municipal, state and provincial, and even federal budgets. So there's a large impact and a large level of visibility that's often presumed to also go part and parcel with an understanding of what a mega project actually is. Now, when we think about, so what kinds of mega projects actually done, there are a host of different kinds of projects that typically fall into that sort of size and scale. So we will see projects in the aerospace sector, for example, developing new aircraft and new airframe platforms. We'll see the construction of airports, of buildings on a very large scale, the construction of canals, dams, hydroelectric projects, as well as stadium sporting venues. When we think about the London 2012 Olympic Games that are just starting up in the next week, and we think about all of the infrastructure that's been put in place for that, all of that investment would be absolutely considered to be a mega project. And that's a project, it's actually many projects that collectively have a significant impact because the eyes of the world are on them. And they need to have the venues, and they need to have the athletes' villages and all of the other facilities ready and available for a very specific, very tight deadline to support a 2-week event. And what's interesting about the current games is that in terms of all of the facilities that have been developed for the London 2012 Olympics, only 6 buildings are actually intended to stay standing after the games. Everything is designed to be both recyclable but also reusable, and many of the buildings will be moved to different locations elsewhere in the country once the London Games are over. So a very interesting way of approaching those projects, which adds its own level of complexity to how they're managed. Now we also think about information technology projects. This isn't going to be your typical IT project, but very significant, large-scale, often at this point governmental level information technology platforms and projects. The oil and gas sector, the construction or remediation of ports, the development of rail or rapid transit facilities, bridge and highway development, science and pure research projects, spaceflight projects, urban renewal projects, and water infrastructure projects. All of those represent sort of that overall collective set of typical categories that we see mega projects occur. Now the interesting thing is when we think about mega projects, a lot of times they're viewed as being more public sector in nature, and certainly some of the most visible ones, because they're using tax dollars, because they are being paid for out of the public purse, are often seen to be public sector projects. Those tend to be the ones that are most visible in the media and in the news. But we also have a number of organizations throughout the world that also invest on a private sector basis in the development of mega projects as well. So we think about the developments, for example, going on in the Alberta oil sands, developing the mining and the resource extraction and the upgrading and even the pipeline facilities to support that area. What you have is many mega projects going on simultaneously. Currently, there are about $140 billion worth of projects underway, solely in the province of Alberta, developing the Alberta oil sands. So we do have public sector projects, we do have highly visible public projects, we also have large-scale private sector investments as well that also fall within the mega project category. Now, when we think about mega projects as a different reality, often, firstly, what makes them different, obviously, is size. The scale of managing a project with a budget of $1 billion or more is far beyond the imagination many of us can project of what it would take to be able to actually manage something of that scale. And that is certainly the key difference. Size is an obvious differentiator. They're measured on a scale that most projects are not. But the impact of mega projects isn't just measured in cost. And often they have a very different level of technical complexity. One of the interesting things about mega projects is they are, when you think about the size and you think about the scale, risky in and of themselves. But what's interesting is, in order to mitigate that risk where you think they would then use safer approaches, more familiar, more well-understood techniques, they are often the projects that will pioneer new techniques, new technologies, new approaches of being able to manage. So one of the interesting things that characterizes mega projects is not just simply size and scale, but also the technical complexity and often the technical novelty that is associated with managing those projects. They will often introduce new technologies, new approaches, and new techniques in terms of being able to be managed. They do have a different order of magnitude of risk as well, and you will have contingency budgets that are larger than what many of us would consider just a normal budget for a project, that vastly outstrip the size of many project budgets. So the risks are on a different scale, and because of the scale, the means of both identifying and defining risk, and particularly the means of risk mitigation, is a much, much larger challenge and a significant level of focus in terms of managing megaprojects. They are also a different level of organizational complexity, and that goes part and parcel with the next point, the number of people in the organizations that are involved. When you're managing a megaproject, you often have a workforce of, on the project team, upwards of 1,000, 2,000, maybe 5,000 people. And that workforce, that project team, or those project teams, because they're not just one, are typically drawn from a number of different organizations, each of whom have their own responsibilities to the project, each of whom have their own contracts defining their scope of obligations, and their authorities, that all has to be collectively managed in order to be able to have that project actually deliver successfully. So the HR practices associated with managing megaprojects is something on a very different scale. If you think about a project of 1,000 or 2,000 people, there are organizations that are far, far smaller than that temporary project team. And rather, though, than being one collective organization with one defined mission, we're having people that are being drawn from multiple different organizations, necessarily having to work together on that project, and needing to be able to appropriately manage interfaces, appropriately manage dependencies, appropriately manage workloads and spatial impacts of working in the same physical environment, where often you're dealing with communication and relationships that work across organizational boundaries, and because they're across organizations, also work across multiple contractual boundaries at the same time. So clearly there are some fundamental differences in terms of what makes a megaproject relative to what we would normally see on a typical, just merely large project. But there are also a much different management challenge because the information that we need to manage around that project is also very different. When we think about how we typically manage a project and the information structure that we employ, generally speaking, when we're developing the project plan, we're putting together our strategy, and particularly when we're developing our schedule and therefore our activities and the work that needs to be done, we manage that around a common work breakdown structure. And the work breakdown structure that's typically developed reflects and mirrors the activities and the work plan that's going to be followed within the overall schedule. So we have a structure that provides the means of organizing and the means of managing across that project. On a mega project, that's a much different challenge, because while there is some methodology breakdown structure that we're going to employ that's going to say, based upon our process, based on how we conduct these kinds of projects, this is what the work breakdown structure would look like, there's going to be a separate and distinct activity breakdown structure that's required in order to be able to actually develop and deliver the project plan. So we're going to take the methodology as defined, but of necessity that has to be adapted, and that needs to be tailored to the requirements of this particular project. Mega projects in particular don't get managed on a cookie-cutter basis. They're unique, they represent unique challenges, and therefore the work that is contained within them often is very, very different. But just that activity breakdown structure isn't alone what's required to be able to manage the project. Oftentimes there is a separate asset breakdown structure that's used to define how costs are managed and how costs are tracked over the course of the project. And that's of necessity from both a project perspective, but also from a critical accounting perspective. When you're managing a massive capital investment, for example, you're not just building one asset. In many cases, you're actually building multiple assets. And from an accounting perspective, they don't necessarily have the same appreciation periods, and they don't necessarily have the same then appreciation schedule once that asset's been operationalized. So just simply from an upfront appropriate asset allocation perspective, there's also need to develop and manage with an understanding of the asset breakdown structure in mind. Over and above that, from an operational perspective, that's usually the basis of how then that resulting capability is actually planned and managed. So the project being completed and handed over, the asset breakdown structure doesn't go away. It actually continues to be used as the basis of being able to actually manage the ongoing operational management of that facility itself and be able to track costs, be able to manage documentation, be able to manage work, and to be able to do maintenance and operational planning around that. Which creates challenges when you come back and then either do a remediation project or you do an expansion. For example, in Alberta a few years ago, Husky Oil was looking at a significant expansion to what was called the Husky Lloydminster Upgrader. It's a petroleum upgrading facility that takes raw crude as its input and actually distills that down to what we would normally recognize as the petroleum projects like gasoline that we then buy at our local gas station as we're filling up our cars. The challenge with that expansion was that the existing operational plant was operationally managed based upon the asset breakdown structure that had been used when the plant was actually first built. And it was first built using both management practices and information systems that no longer existed within the organization. And new information systems that were in place and new standards for projects that were now actually being adhered to adopted a very different way of managing asset information and asset structures. So you had an existing operational plant that used one asset breakdown structure and a brand new project that was, by the standards of the day, expected to use a very different asset breakdown structure where once the project was done, it was all going to be one common facility. So one significant management challenge was how do we reconcile and bring those together? And how do we both manage to the old structure while still maintaining the integrity of information around the new processes? We've got resource breakdown structures, and that gets down to understanding the various organizations and the various individuals that are involved. We have document breakdown structures, how to manage and how to track and how to monitor the thousands and tens of thousands of pages of documentation that gets associated with managing a project of this scale. And when a mega project is done, and when project documentation is archived, that can be hundreds, if not thousands, of file storage boxes of information that are associated with that project. To give you kind of scale that we're talking about in terms of the amount of paperwork that's actually produced. If you think about a construction project building a new large-scale facility, one contractor out of several on that project responsible for, say, a workload of 100 people. Their invoice on a monthly basis with appropriate accounting for timesheets and the use of not just labor but also equipment and materials can quite literally occupy a single filing box. Now you multiply that by, first off, the number of copies of the invoice that are submitted, 3, and you multiply that by the number of months of the project and the number of contractors that are working on that project, and simply the process of invoicing and managing the invoice information becomes an absolutely mammoth document management challenge. And so we need to have in place not just an appropriate document breakdown structure, but a document management process to be able to go with that. There is some consideration of a maintenance breakdown structure. We talked about this when we were talking about the asset breakdown structure as well. What happens once the project is actually operationalized, once the results are handed over? There needs to be in place a structure to be able to manage information around effort, around cost, around the allocation and assignment of maintenance and operational activities to be able to continue to maintain that facility going forward. And there's the chart of accounts for the organization, which is the overall structure by which the finances are actually managed within the general ledger of that organization. And that needs to be reconciled with all of the financial information being provided by all of the individual organizations that are actually working on billing to and contributing costs to that overall project. So all of these structures are operational concurrently and provide different ways of looking at, different lenses to be able to explore the absolute mammoth amount of information that gets produced when a mega project is being conducted. And the challenge is being able to work with and be able to reconcile this in terms of managing the overall project. So it's not just about it's a big project and we take our skills and extrapolate upwards. We're actually introducing very different management structures, very different management processes, and have a need for different systems and processes in place to be able to manage the scope and scale of this work and the documentation that this work produces. We've got to be able to integrate as well across multiple organizations. And we have to be able to integrate budgets. We need to be able to integrate schedules. We need to be able to integrate document management. And in terms of document management, that's everything from the deliverables that are being produced within the project itself to the management documentation that supports how that project's actually being managed, the quality assurance and control, and making sure that there is an appropriate and proper workflow and chain of custody of inspection, testing, and compliance documentation associated with the QA and QC processes. And also the operations documentation that needs to get produced and ultimately will be handed over to the operational organization once the project's all are done and complete. And the challenge is we've got multiple different organizations that are all feeding different aspects of this information into the overall project. So there's a need for a level of both standard setting up front and standards coordination out the back end in order to be able to make sure that this all works together. And this is where some of the greatest amount of administrative effort actually occurs in terms of managing a project of this scale. As an example, the budgets. Typically speaking, when an organization is working on a project, it has timesheets in place, and they adopt a number of different formats depending upon the organization, and depending on the contract, they reflect different levels of information around what's actually being billed and charged back to the customer organization. On large-scale mega projects, the administrative effort and the coordination effort of bringing together those invoices and those timesheets and those labor and equipment material reports is so complex that oftentimes that actually gets pushed back out on the contracted organizations to be able to manage and support. So what that means is that the budgets, regardless of how an organization needs to set it up to manage for its own internal requirements as a supplier or as a contractor to that organization, also then needs to be able to feed into the chart of accounts and the budget reporting requirements of their customer. And so they really have to have the ability to be able to manage two very different views of their accounting information at the same time, what they need for their chart of accounts to be able to manage their expenses, while at the same time feeding into the chart of accounts of their customer, so that in essence they're providing an invoice that guides the customer around how that invoice gets coded to that customer's actual GL codes. And I have seen, for example, contractor organizations where even though they're working for the same organization, because they are working on different projects for different divisions within that same organization, they're being asked to use different GL codes on one project than they are on another, because the organizations are large enough and complex enough that they either have different codes for different types of projects, or quite literally they have redundancies and errors within their own accounting systems that are getting perpetuated and manifested by different areas of the organization that only really get noticed by the organizations that work with them and feed information into them. So a specific organization may actually have to keep track of several different chart of accounts, even having to work for the same customer. And schedules are no different. Having to be able to manage and integrate the working schedules of multiple contract organizations into one overall master schedule for a master project is a mammoth undertaking. And typically scheduling organizations on a project of this scale alone have anywhere between 10 and upwards of 25 to 30 people simply to be able to manage the master schedule and manage the integration of the component schedules from their subcontractors into the overall single master schedule view. And document management is a similar challenge and a very similar scale of administrative management to be able to deal with. So the very fact that we've got to be able to integrate across multiple organizations, we've got to be able to integrate the work of across multiple contracts into a overall single record of the project creates a huge amount of administrative work and a huge scope of administrative workload for those organizations, the customer organization, but also the individual contractor organizations that are working for them. And as I've said already, we also have a level of complexity that gets managed on a different scale when we're dealing with a project of this size, when we're dealing with a mega project. Mega projects are often experimental in nature, and they are using new materials, they're using new techniques, they're using new technology in order to be able to develop and to be able to produce the project results. Part of the reason that it's this large and part of the reason it's this complex is because in many cases we've not done this before, and in fact nobody has done this before. And so part of the challenge of managing mega projects is dealing with complexity of technology, is dealing with the management of innovation, and is dealing with the risk associated with adopting and using different materials and techniques and technology. We're also dealing with much more complex challenges because even though the technology may have been tried previously on a smaller scale, what we're now having to deal with is actually scaling that up and assuming, or at times hoping, that the technology will in fact scale to the level that's necessary for the project itself to be successful. And we're also seeing greater levels of integration, the need to be able to manage the integration of different aspects of the project coming together, so managing dependencies between different components or different modules of the project results, as well as levels of integration and coordination across different organizations that are actually contributing to the overall project effort. Let's talk about some examples, some actual real-life examples to illustrate some of these points, because when we talk about it in the abstract, it's easy to say, well, yes, new technology and new techniques and harder to be able to do, but how hard and how different and how challenging is that really? For example, if we think about the construction of the Boeing 787 Dreamliner, hugely popular and now historically seen as successful project because we've hit construction and delivery. But while the project was underway, significant challenges were experienced, and there was a great deal of negative press and question about the ability to be able to successfully deliver this aircraft. And that was a result of the aircraft adopting some very radical and very different techniques from traditional aircraft production processes. Part of it was simply the design. You had a long-range plane that was being designed as, rather than a four-engine, a twin-engine plane with a radically different airframe, a very different shape of wing that is designed to be able to make the aircraft much more fuel efficient, be able to have much greater degree of range, even with when compared with a more conventional aircraft design. A significant challenge of this was the technology that was used to be able to develop it. In order to be able to make it fuel efficient, one of the obvious challenges in terms of creating fuel efficient aircraft is the weight of the aircraft. And to be able to reduce the weight as much as possible, Boeing was the first airline manufacturer to make extensive use of carbon fiber materials in the construction of the airframe. Now, carbon fiber wasn't new. As a technology, it's been used extensively in motorsports. It's been extensively used in the construction of racing cars, of now production cars, as well as motorcycles, recognized as being a very strong, very lightweight, very easy to work with technology to be able to build very strong structural components. But that was on the size and scale of a motorcycle. It was on the size and scale of a car. We're now talking about building that on the size and scale of an airplane, where the stresses and the requirements and the tolerance for error is much, much, much greater in terms of expectations and much lower in terms of tolerances. You can't have your airframe structure delaminating in flight. That would be beyond desirable. You can't have the aircraft disintegrate. It needs to be able to hold itself together. It needs to be able to maintain structural integrity. And so Boeing had to figure out ways of being able to manufacture and work with carbon fiber on a much, much larger scale than had ever been done before in order to be able to figure out how to be able to develop the plane. And this wasn't worked through before the project was started. This was what happened while they were actually doing the project. Part of the design of it and part of the manufacture was being able to develop the techniques that would allow them to scale up their approach and be able to actually take a theoretical concept and turn it into something that was real and turn it into something that was replicatable and able to be consistently performed on an operational basis in the manufacture of multiple airplanes. As well, this was one of the most outsourced airplane projects ever done. Boeing was the overall coordinator and contractor, if you will, that was responsible for the actual integration and the final assembly of the aircraft. But each of the component systems was fundamentally outsourced to different providers quite literally around the world. And so you had different components coming from very different regions where wings were being developed in one company in one country, the airframe itself being developed elsewhere, the aircraft, the wiring looms being assembled by yet another contractor, and all of it expecting to be able to come together in Washington State at Boeing's manufacturing facility and be able to assemble a plane. And actually working through the coordination and integration challenges across that was an ongoing significant challenge for Boeing. They actually had situations where, for example, they would get a wiring loom that would have been built, and this involved thousands of cables that had been put together to be able to feed signals and electricity throughout the plane, and being shipped and being a foot too short to actually install. And so that entire loom having to be basically ripped apart and rebuilt. Significant delay and significant expense in terms of the overall project. So a number of technical challenges, a number of integration challenges, a number of overall management challenges across multiple organizations in terms of being able to build that project. Second project I want to take a look at is the Confederation Bridge project. This is a bridge that connects the mainland of Canada with the province of Prince Edward Island. As the name implies, Prince Edward Island was traditionally an island. It was completely surrounded by water, and that meant the only way of actually being able to get to the island was either by water, by ferry, or by aircraft. And while a project of a fixed link had been considered for a period of time, that was only ever really brought together as a project about 10 years ago. And in building this project, a number of engineering challenges, again, had to be worked through. The construction gantry that was used to be able to develop and to lay the bridge was actually a free-floating ship that was custom designed and built in order to be able to actually build this project. So before they could actually take on one project, they had to do a completely different project, which was to contract for the development of a floating heavy lift vessel that could actually manage the placement of the concrete pylons and then the installation of the bridge spans that ultimately allowed the bridge itself to be developed and built. As well, what's famous for this project, it is the largest bridge ever constructed, the longest bridge ever constructed over icy waters. And one of the significant challenges of the construction of the bridge was building the pylons, the individual supports that exist at the end of each span that you can see receding off into the distance, to be able to resist the buildup and the flow of significant amounts of ice that occur every winter as the mouth of the St. Lawrence freezes. And so significant engineering challenges that, while on a laboratory basis they believed they had solutions that would work, needed to then be managed to be able to scale up in order to be able to actually develop the project itself. A third project, the CERN Collider on the boundary of France and Switzerland, which has been in the news lately in terms of announcing the discovery of the Higgs boson, the God particle, if you will. Massive, massive, massive project built to be able to detect something, or to try to be able to create and detect something that scientists weren't sure actually existed. And so having to work through from a theoretical basis, this should work, and what should be necessary to be able to do this, where the science had never actually been conducted before. The experiments had never actually been conducted in a way to be able to say, this is how you build one of these. They've been done on a smaller scale, but never built on this level. And a similar challenge, again in North America, this is the National Institute for Nanotechnology in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. This was a significant project to specifically build a building to be able to support nanotechnology research. And the challenge in terms of doing this, the challenges in terms of building a project with scale, were numerous. They had to not just build a building, but they had to build a building that was silent, that was resistant to electromagnetic radiation, that was resistant to vibration, to be able to, and this is where it gets very interesting, support the installation of equipment that hadn't been designed, that didn't exist, and where the technology, the equipment that did exist, by the time the building was actually constructed, would actually be obsolete. Because of the rapid pace of research in the field of nanotechnology right now, and because of the rapid pace of development, technologies are being developed and working through all the way to obsolescence in the space of a couple of years. And so here was the development of a multi-billion-dollar facility to be able to house and enable the conducting of nanotechnology-related experiments, where you had to build the building and you had to be able to create a shell and you had to be able to define space and facilities in an environment where there wasn't certainty of what's actually going to go into it and what are the requirements going to be around how that gets developed. So significant challenge of being able to work through the unknown of what might that technology look like and how might it work and what might be necessary then in terms of being able to build this facility to standards that aren't clear because we don't know specifically what technology is actually going to go into it. All of these highlight not unique in and of the individual projects, but not unique challenges in terms of managing mega projects. Mega projects typically run into challenges of this level of complexity and this level of challenge. And the issue is being able to, with each project, deal with the unique issues around the challenges that are being faced and the challenges that are being brought to bear by that project. Each mega project will have challenges, will have complexity, will have very significant issues that need to be able to work through, none of which are likely to ever have been seen before. And so the challenge is working through dealing with the unknown and managing levels of risk on a scale that typically are well above and beyond what we typically see in a normal project. Now, for all their differences, there are still similarities in terms of how mega projects are managed and similarities in terms of overlaps of challenges and situations that are encountered on mega project that we also see on projects on a much smaller scale. One of the common misperceptions is the presumption that mega projects are more successful because of that level of visibility, because of that level of focus, because of that level of complexity, and therefore the level of management focus around that. The presumption is because they're getting focus and because they're getting effort and because they have a large management process in place, they must be more successful. And in fact, that actually is frequently challenged. Most mega projects run into extensive issues around scope, and in particular, underestimation of costs and overestimation of benefits in terms of the delivery of those projects. Now I'm going to deal with each one of these in turn, starting with the scope issues. In developing a mega project, upfront planning is often a significant proportion of the project initiation process. That involves the defining and the planning and ultimately obtaining approval of that project. And that's a significant effort. If you think about what is required to be comfortable signing off on a 2 or a 5 or a 15 or a $50 billion project, there is a lot of research and a lot of work and a lot of evaluation that needs to be done to be able to get to a confidence level about being able to deliver that project. That often requires years of effort to conduct and can require as much as a third of the budget of the project simply to be able to work through. There's a significant amount of work and a significant amount of investment in that research and upfront planning process to be able to deliver that project. Now, despite that upfront planning, scope management itself is often not present or inadequate. And there are routinely challenges around failures to identify changes to scope, and in particular, failure to assess and ensure the acceptance of impacts of changes as they're going along. The sheer number of changes that occur and are encountered on a project of this scale are massive, and the administrative management that needs to be proactively put in place to be able to ensure appropriate scope management is significant. A project that I was a assessor and auditor of after the fact, very interesting scenario where it was a $5 billion development project. It was developing a large-scale industrial facility. And a contractor that had been engaged to do the electrical work for each of the individual modules on the project had started out with contractual responsibilities for 2 modules out of 75 that represented the overall scope of the facility as a whole. Because of performance issues with other contractors, because of both delays that were being encountered, as well as issues around substandard work and substandard labor forces, there were a number of contractors that had been on site that were actually evicted from the project, and this one contractor was asked to progressively take on more work and more work and more responsibility, where they progressed to being responsible for the electrical work on close to 45 of the overall modules once their full scope of work was fully assessed. And the challenge was neither the customer or the contractor appropriately actually documented that. So this contractor's work alone went from an initial budget of about $7 million to almost $85 million with no corresponding documentation. Nothing more than verbal authorization. And as invoices kept on going in, and as costs kept on increasing, eventually an accountant somewhere looked at all of this and said, hang on, what's going on here? Who authorized this? And that subsequently resulted in that contractor going through about 4.5 months of legal hassles and negotiation and documentation and rationalization over the costs and why the costs were being incurred, even though they had been authorized by their customer to be able to take on that work, simply because we weren't seeing the actual corresponding amendment in the contracts that needed to occur to be able to create the contractual mechanism for that one firm to be able to do the work. And it wasn't they had necessarily done anything wrong in terms of the work, but they hadn't provided the documentation necessary to be able to confirm that everybody knew and everybody agreed the impact of what had been taken on. So as responsibility for a new module was being taken on, there was an understanding of what had been done, what was done that was substandard and would need to be reworked, what was still remaining to be done, and then what was the estimate that would be now required for this particular contractor to be able to finish off and deliver the module to the specifications that were set. Scope management gives us the tools to be able to do that, to be able to identify the requests, to be able to assess what the impacts are, to be able to make sure that the impacts have been communicated, and in fact there's acceptance of both the contracting organization and the customer. Yes, we're all on board to do that. The issue was this hadn't occurred. It just simply hadn't happened. And so the organization was faced with the challenge of having to defend what it had legitimately been asked to do. Estimation issues. Projects are actually consistently underestimated. According to research by Ben Flyberg and a team of researchers in Europe looking at transportation megaprojects, 86% of projects in their study, and this represented about 46 large-scale megaprojects, transportation projects largely, within the European Union, 86% of them were underestimated. The actual costs on average were 28% higher than the estimates. And in particular, what they found in their research was the underestimation is systemic. It's not accidental, it's deliberate. And the underestimates were far greater in magnitude than any instance was where overestimates had occurred. It wasn't just that it was a random, we're not good at estimating and sometimes it's too much and sometimes it's too less. There was a conscious and systemic, planned underestimation of the projects. And the simple fact of knowing that didn't result in any way in a change in the behavior. And we see similar challenges in terms of the estimation of benefits. Project benefits are consistently overestimated, particularly for megaprojects. According to the same research team, more than 90% of forecasts for rail projects, as an example, were overestimated. And those estimates, those overestimates, were on an average of 105%. So the forecasted benefits for the project were typically more than twice what they actually should have been. And for 84% of the projects, the actual traffic is more than 20% below forecast, where none of them have actual traffic that's more than 20% above the forecast. What the research team found was that both the systemic underestimation of costs and overestimation of benefits was a result largely of planners and also sponsors working to try to get projects approved, and recognizing that if they were honest about what the costs were, or they were honest about what the benefits were, the projects wouldn't likely to be approved. And therefore, as a result, by deliberately manipulating and deliberately misleading, cost estimates were being put in place, benefits estimates were being put in place that allowed projects initially to be approved, that then subsequently had to be significantly amended in terms of budget amendments and also in terms of revisions of forecast, where once that project had been started, there was much more reluctance to actually subsequently turn around and cancel that project. So what are the lessons of managing megaprojects? What insights can we gain from megaprojects and both their challenges as well as their unique attributes that we can then think about applying to our projects? One thing we need to be able to recognize is that they are challenged, and when megaprojects fail, they fail spectacularly. They also do it more frequently. According to research by independent project analysts, a company called IPA, megaprojects fail at more than double the rates of simply really big projects. Megaprojects also either go very well or they go very badly. There is no middle ground. It is rare, in fact, it is not seen that you have a middlingly successful megaproject. You either have an exceptionally successful megaproject or you have an exceptionally bad megaproject. There is no middle ground in between those. But where megaprojects fail, that failure is a result of not doing the things that we know we should do in managing projects. It's not a question of the projects are unique and the challenges of managing projects are so unique that the management tools simply don't exist or aren't relevant on that scale. The tools exist, we know what the tools are, we know how to be able to do it, it's simply not being done. So we know how to avoid the failures. The challenge is we don't do it, and the evidence suggests that we know we don't do it. In fact, it suggests that at times it's being done systematically and deliberately. Now, change is possible. It is possible to successfully manage and deliver a mega project, and it is absolutely successful on that basis to introduce the appropriate management systems necessary to be successful. But what that means is we have to want to change in terms of our practices, and we need to stop getting a payoff from our current or lack of practices that are being employed. We need to accept and recognize the value of the discipline that project management gives us and actually apply it. And this isn't really a big surprise, or it certainly shouldn't be. And it's certainly not a finding that's unique to mega projects either. Looking at project failures, and I've spent a number of years auditing and assessing both successful projects and projects that have been unsuccessful, where projects have failed, it's typically been as a result of inappropriate management discipline being applied at one of two levels. Either the project management team didn't apply appropriate management discipline in managing the project, or the sponsorship team overrode that and didn't appropriately play their role in terms of providing appropriate governance and oversight of the project, staying close to it, understanding it, providing approvals as necessary, and providing the support and assistance that's required for the project team itself to actually be successful. In terms of the issues of estimation errors, there are two fundamental reasons for the identified problems. One is that it's a genuine challenge in terms of being able to estimate. It's simply hard to estimate projects on this scale. And the other one is there's deliberate under and or overestimation in order to serve an agenda. And the evidence that the research is supportive so far does in fact suggest there is deliberate manipulation, where projects would not have been approved if costs were estimated at their likely level, and projects would not have been approved if the benefits were actually honestly projected. The challenge there is that addressing that requires a desire for improvement. Techniques exist to improve estimation accuracy, even with the uncertainty of mega-project scale projects. And the simple use of reference class forecasting, of being able to look at what are projects that are similar to this, and what are those projects' experiences, and based on those project experiences, what can we extrapolate in terms of what's necessary to estimate this project. The techniques are known, the techniques are taught, the techniques work, but they're simply not being applied. And the biggest challenge in terms of overcoming that is planners and project owners fundamentally need to expect and demand honest estimates. And that often is as much challenge of the governance as it is of the project managers or the planners. Sometimes it is about project managers giving people answers that they want to hear. But often it's the result of that is because the expectation is created, this is the answer that I expect to hear. And so the presumption of what the estimate is going to be is anchored long before the actual work necessary to be able to plan that project has actually occurred. So where does that leave us? In conclusion, mega projects are different than normal projects, no question. And they are different both in their size as well as in terms of their rate of failure. Why mega projects fail are for the same reason that normal ones do, and that is fundamentally as a result of mismanagement and as a result of underestimation of the costs and benefits. We already know what it takes to be able to improve management. We know what those practices should be, and we know what those practices look like. We just don't always do what we're supposed to do. And making changes to that requires political will. The big question is what it will take to be able to attain that will. What's necessary to be able to make the changes that are necessary to create an environment where underestimating of costs and overestimating of benefits isn't accepted, isn't allowed, and therefore doesn't occur. That brings us to the end of the presentation and the start of our Q&A session. Just a quick recap in terms of the process to be able to pose a question. If you do have questions, you have a comments box on the right-hand side of your screen. Please just type your question into there, and we will work through any questions that we have gathered as we've gone through. Again, we may not have time to get through all of the questions that have been posed, but we'll do our best to be able to work through as many as we can in the time that we do have available. So first question that we've got is, you talked about the management processes that aren't being used. Are there specific techniques that are most commonly not being applied or most commonly should be applied in terms of addressing some of those challenges? And that's a great question. On the whole, they're twofold. I've already spoken about one, and that's scope management. I'll give you an example of that. There is an audit report that was done for the City of Calgary about a year ago now. And that was a review of a major infrastructure project. It was the expansion and widening of a major artery within the City of Calgary. And one of the most damning criticisms within the audit report was that the budget for that project had exploded from initially $25 million up to $160 million. Now, that project wasn't on the scale, obviously, of a mega project, but it was a very significant project, it was a very visible project, and it was a very high-profile and political project. And the interesting thing in terms of reviewing the audit report was that the committed budget up front, the initial $25 million, while it was appropriate for doing what was initially forecast, the failure to manage the change was there actually was significant expansion of the requirements and the expectation and the amenities and facilities and features of how that project was actually done. And all of that had come from somewhere. All of it had actually been requested, demanded, approved by the elected representatives. So the larger challenge in terms of the audit findings were that there wasn't appropriate documentation to be able to support and evidence that. So even though the project team was being told, and the challenge here is, because it's a political imperative, the perception is, I must do this, there wasn't then the formal following up and recognizing of what is the impact of the changes being asked, what does that do to the overall budget, is there approval to actually be able to proceed. And the funding increases had been approved. There were minutes from council meetings that indicated that the budget had now grown to X and then Y and then ultimately Z. But the management documentation associated with that was never actually produced and wasn't actually available to the audit team. So one of the challenges is appropriate scope management, and recognizing that that has to be managed on 3 different levels. I need to be able to actually manage the scope changes to my project itself. I need to be able to articulate and communicate organizationally how does that actually change the funding and budget of the project. And thirdly, I need to appropriately manage then how that changes any contracts associated with the delivery of that scope. So when we put a scope management in place, it has to consciously actually address how that actually gets delivered. And it has to consciously be able to comprise those 3 components: managing the change of the scope of the project, managing the budget and funding, and also managing the contractual change. The other aspect of that is risk management. And one of the fundamental aspects that projects of any scale cannot afford to ignore is risk management. And making sure that there's an appropriate process in place to initially identify potential risks associated with the project, and ultimately to be able to then evaluate their impacts, to be able to develop whatever appropriate mitigation, avoidance, or transference strategy may be employed, and to continue to be able to revise and update that risk plan on an ongoing basis. Research has demonstrated that risk management is the most important project management technique, and if you did nothing but risk management, you would be further ahead than singly employing any other project management technique in the project manager's arsenal. Now, a question we've had brought forward: if a typical project spends 5% of the budget and time and or money on project management activities, do Megaprojects require more? Is that double or is that triple? And that's a great question. It's a great question on a number of levels, because the number 5% got added there. And the reality is that's not actually a firm number either. I've seen some projects that have actually had project management budgets of 20 and 25% of the budget, and others that have only required 2 or 3% of the budget. And a lot of that actually depends on both the underlying size of the project as well as the technical complexity that the project actually involves as well. On a mega project, the project management budget is significant, there is no question, and it is measured in millions. But interestingly, because of the large scale of the costs itself, the actual principal costs of the project management itself could actually be smaller. It could be still in the 3 to 4 to 5%. Typically speaking, I think it probably goes up towards 8 or 9%, and that's particularly true if you look at the project management function as not being simply the owner's representative on that project, but also all of the project management that's required in, as well, the individual subcontractors that are also doing that work on that project as well. Last question we have: for the projects initially, when the timelines are fixed, if there's slippages, when do you go for fast tracking and when do you go for crashing activity? Great question, and again, there's no hard and fast rule around this. This really gets tied to the risk management strategy. The thing to keep in mind, though, is particularly on a mega project, fast tracking and crashing are both high risk endeavors and have the potential to significantly delay the overall project. So it's something that needs to be considered very, very carefully, and largely, I think a larger issue that needs to be faced is making sure the optimal budget is in place up front, the optimal time is in place up front, and we don't try to be too aggressive and too optimistic about what it's going to take to be able to do. And that's the big challenge associated with underestimating projects. we do lowball. We lowball the timeline, and we lowball the cost, and then we create problems for ourselves down the road. And then when we then try to accelerate it, by crashing or by fast-tracking the project, we actually compound those challenges because we're now creating more risk and we're creating less tolerance for error at the same time. Great questions. Thank you very much. That does bring us to the time that we have available. Just a couple of final things to wrap up our conversation here. This is a Project Headway webinar. What is Project Headway? It is Ganthead.com's process for project management, and it's designed to be able to provide organizations, project managers, and project teams with processes that allow them to be able to manage their projects and programs within a defined and established project framework. It is simple and straightforward. It is open for free to all Premium Plus and corporate members of Ganthead.com. If you collect PDUs, to claim PDU information for this webinar, go to the My Account on the Ganthead website, and from there you can click on the PDUs awarded link, and from there you'll be able to actually access the PDU award certificate, which will allow you to then claim your PDUs on the PMI website. If you do have any problems with getting your PDU certificate from the site, again, please do email Heather, and she can be reached at heather@ganthead.com. There will be a short feedback survey that's going to be forwarded to you by email. We do appreciate you taking time to be able to provide your feedback. Let us know how we're doing with the series, what you like about it, what you'd like to see improved, what you'd like to be covered off in terms of a future topic. Should take about 3 minutes to complete, and would encourage you to do so at the close of the webinar. Last point, if you could mark your calendars, our next webinar is for Thursday, the 16th of August, 2012, and our topic for that time is going to be low-impact project management. How can we get out from under all that paper? So we'll look forward to seeing you next month. That brings us to the conclusion of our webinar for today. If you have questions for me, Mark Mullaly, you can reach me by email at mark.mullaly@interthink.ca. If you're interested in Project Headway, please contact Gina Jones, and she can be reached at gina@ganthead.com. I'd like to thank you very much for your time and attention this month. Have a great month. We'll look forward to seeing you next time. And in the meantime, good luck with your projects. Thank you so much. Have a great day.